Well, the lunchtime meal is an oddity. Breakfast is mostly straightforward. For most of us, it's bacon and eggs or cereal and toast. And dinner is some kind of variation on meat and potatoes. At least this is true in North America. If you travel to Great Britain, you'll find that the midday meal is more like dinner. And it follows a mid-morning meal called a levenses, which is tea and something to nibble on, which is also what you have as fourses. So British people tend to sort of eat through the day. Now the dinner time meal that they have is called tea, and it consists of sandwiches without crusts, scones with jam, and clotted cream. Now don't be fooled by the name clotted cream. When I was 9 years old, my family went to England, and our relatives told us we were going to have clotted cream. And my expectation was something like ice cream, as being a Canadian. So imagine my disappointment when clotted cream was something like sour cream, but without the flavor. Ugh. So what do you have for lunch? Now, it depends largely on your ethnic background. A bagel with lox, samosas, or a hot dog. So we might have a hard time imagining 2 fish and 5 barley loaves as a typical lunch. But in first century Palestine, that's what a poor person would have. Barley is one of the first crops to be harvested. So it was one of the first fruits that was offered to God. And the prophet Elisha received 20 loaves of barley and fresh ears of corn as a tribute. And normally this would be given to the priests to distribute to the people. But Elisha decided to skip the bureaucracy and give the gifts to the people by himself. Well, was this the pattern for the story from the Gospel of John about Jesus feeding 5,000 people? Is this something that God is continuing to do? In the Gospel of Matthew, there were 2 feeding stories, with 5,000 in one and 4,000 in another. So clearly, these feeding miracles are trying to tell us something very important. When I lived in Toronto, my church held a monthly meal for the homeless and the underhoused. And we served roast beef with all the trimmings. We had asked them whether they wanted a weekly meal of soup and sandwiches or something simple, or a monthly dinner. And they said that they wanted to get a real home-cooked meal because they could get soup and sandwiches just about anywhere. So we decided on the 3rd Saturday of the month because that's when people said that their money was running out. And we served up a roast beef dinner. And we brought out these steaming, chafing dishes with roast beef, mashed potatoes, and vegetables. And we had one rule, that people could have more, but they needed to line up again so that everybody had a chance to get something. Well, this gym held about 350 people. And we saw a turnover on average of about 3 times. So we figured that we served around 1,000 meals. And as soon as we cleaned up, we started planning for the next one. You see, we didn't have any funding. We didn't have a budget. Every month we began all over again. And out of people's generosity, we were able to provide this meal on an ongoing basis. And this is my version of the fish and the barley. I wonder if something else was happening on that grassy field where the people had come to see Jesus. Following Jesus was a side trip for them. They were going to celebrate the Passover, and this was a detour. Well, the Passover was a feast, a celebration, and a ritual. It wasn't like dropping into somebody's house for supper. And they most likely would have been carrying some provisions for this meal with them. Now, a boy with two fish and 5 barley loaves gave them to Jesus. It was probably everything that he had. Like the widow who gave her last 2 coins, Jesus probably marveled at his generosity. Openness to God leads to an open heart, which leads to open hands. This example of generosity and gratitude would have moved the crowd. Jesus blessed the bread and gave thanks to God, just as he would at his Last Supper and as he would, or as we also do, at our communion table. Now, I think this is what may have happened. As the baskets came by, people began to share what they had. And at the end, there was enough to fill the baskets, so Jesus said that nothing may be lost. Was he talking about the crumbs or the people who were lost without a shepherd? This whole meal brings to mind the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. Near the end of his life, he prayed for his disciples. I guarded them, and not one was lost, except the one who is destined to be lost. The 12 baskets may also stand for the 12 tribes of Israel. And I read something interesting this week, that maybe the disciples were each given one of those baskets, so that they had something to eat, and they had something to take home to their families. Well, the people's reaction to this miracle is to proclaim that Jesus is the prophet that comes before the Messiah. This is the prophet that they hoped would restore the glory of Israel. Well, Jesus doesn't want earthly power. He resists being taken by force to make him king. I'm not sure how they thought that they could make him a king. There was already a king, Herod Antipas, and he was supported by the Romans. So making Jesus, or anyone else, a king was a direct challenge to both the royal and imperial powers. What were they thinking? Maybe they were hoping for a final battle which would restore Israel and remove the Romans. But sadly, this never happened. And the Romans destroyed the temple and drove out the Jews in the rebellion that happened in 70 CE. And this historical fact would have been known to the first people who received this gospel. Following the feeding of the multitude, the disciples get into a boat and set out for Capernaum. And they left without Jesus. Why? We'll never know. This is what happens when you try to make sense of Bible stories. The original recorders of them were not concerned about a plausible narrative. They were concerned about making a point. When the disciples saw Jesus walking on the water, they were terrified. Now, this story is also in the Gospels of Matthew and Mark. In Matthew's version, Peter gets out of the boat and tries to walk on the water, but fails. And this leads the disciples to declare, "Truly you are the Son of God." And according to the version in Mark, Jesus does get into the boat, but they still don't understand what's happened. Now, John is making a different point in his story. Jesus doesn't get into the boat, even though they're trying to take him. Just as the crowd wanted to take Jesus by force and make him king, the disciples want to force him into the boat. And there are other differences between John's gospel and those of Matthew. In the other gospels, it is Jesus who feeds the crowd, not the disciples in his place. So in this version, the disciples are just the cleanup crew. So we need to ask ourselves, are we willing to do the humble and the unnoticed tasks? We're going to have a meal following the service today. So remember, be one of those who picks up the crumbs, whether you put them in a basket or whatever you do with them, because God notices everything you do. Jesus will be Jesus, and we can't force him to do our bidding or fit neatly into the boxes that we would make for him. So when we want to know what's for lunch, he gives us a feast. He comes to us willingly, but can never be forced. In our world today, sometimes we feel like we're in the middle of a raging storm. powered by public opinion, various forms of media, and persuaders of every kind. Our task is not to steer the boat. I've heard that if you say, Jesus is my co-pilot, you're sitting in the wrong seat. You need to move over. Jesus will steer the boat and will not abandon it. So our job is to listen to the words of Jesus. It is I, do not be afraid. May it be so. Amen. Our following hymn is 508, Just As I Am. We begin our invitation to the offering with the singing of 542.